This instrument is a Japanese flute called a shakuhachi, which is an instrument of Zen practice. And as a professional musician, I was always interested in different instruments from around the world, especially from Oriental countries. And about 30 years ago, I was studying this instrument, and I went to Japan to become more immersed in the study of the shakuhachi. And I lived there for 8 years, and during that time, I became deeply immersed in Buddhist meditation practices and traveled to other parts of Asia and was interested in Tibetan sound healing and yogic practices of different kinds. So I had this sort of developing spiritual path in my life. And then through a series of what at the time seemed like random occurrences, I encountered, whilst I was living there in Japan, in Kyoto, I encountered a group of Brazilian elders from the community of Seudomapia in Amazonas, from the Santo Daime community. They'd been traveling to Japan on and off for a few years, and there was a small group of people there working with them. And because some of my friends were in that group, I became invited. And initially, it was the music that attracted me, even though the music of the Santo Daime is very different from Japanese music or from meditation music that I was involved in. It's very extrovert music, very colorful, rhythmical, simple songs with guitars and percussion. But I was able to intuitively feel this music came from the same place, from some kind of sacred source, from some kind of astral region where all the sacred music came from. I was very drawn to that and drawn to the people who were holding the ceremonies. And so I began to attend these ceremonies. And then the Santo Daime revealed to me that I had this healing path. A deep process of healing was opened for me. And so I began to commit to that as a practice which ran in parallel with my other practices of meditation and Buddhist practices. And after a while, I began to travel more in Brazil, and after 8 years living in Japan, I began to spend extended periods of time living in Brazil in Santo Daime communities in Amazonas and Acre and Minas Gerais and other places in Brazil. And after a few years and many ceremonies and becoming fully immersed in the Santo Daime tradition and also starting to receive my own songs and hymns and becoming a fadado in the Santo Daime tradition, I was one day entrusted with a few liters of daime to open a ceremony with a few friends back in Japan. And so the group there began to grow of its own accord in the absence of the Brazilian elders. And we were introduced to this concept of holding space and taking responsibility for that. And then later, at the end of the 1990s, I moved back to the UK with my Japanese wife, Noriko, and we began the first UK Santo Daime group there, which in the beginning was only 4 people. It was myself, Noriko, and 2 English friends who had traveled with us already to Brazil. It was a very private, intimate group. We didn't promote anything. We weren't looking for anyone else to join us. It was our spiritual practice that we took seriously. But as with the nature of these things, the group began to grow. 1, 2 people more came, and then a few more people became 10 people, became 20, 30. And as these people started to arrive, we began to take more seriously the sense of responsibility. And what initially was a personal path of healing became revealed more as a path of service to the Santo Daime, to the teachings of the Santo Daime, and to the communities where this medicine comes from, and service to the people who are arriving in this healing work. And the group began to grow. We ultimately, after 10 years, we were regularly doing sessions with 80 or even 100 people. And we realized that we needed some kind of formal organization to represent our group and our activities. We were importing a lot of sacrament from Brazil, and So we formed an organization. Our group was called the Eternal Heart Center, and we formed a not-for-profit company. So we were able to be transparent in the accounting of the donations we were receiving, and all the daime we were receiving from Brazil was carefully logged, and we were able to take more responsibility for how we were screening people coming into the groups. We interviewed people, and we had consent forms. We had a process of educating people. We began to strengthen links with individuals and communities in Brazil and other Santo Daime groups in other places. And throughout all of this, our work was growing with a great sense of abundance. Everybody was receiving so much healing, a sense of well-being. There was so much light and love and transformation happening within individuals and within the community as a whole. And we could feel that the community was a living spiritual community, as in the Buddhist context of a sangha, which is reflected in the Santo Daime concept of the Irmandade. And a lot of the concepts of Buddhist spiritual practice of developing compassion and mindfulness and meditation, working with developing awareness and the light of consciousness, whereas similar themes in Santo Daime practice. And so these two worlds began to merge. And the nature of our group, although always rooted in Santo Daime traditions, began to incorporate some mantras and chants and different meditation practices. So the group was growing beautifully in this way, when suddenly, without any warning, in September 2010, I was sitting in my house in a very peaceful rural community in South Devon in England, when a lot of police suddenly turned up with flashing lights and police vans and cars, and a lot of policemen came to my door of my house. They were wearing full protective clothing, and they brought a battering ram to break down the door in case we were not home. And they sat me down, they searched the house. They didn't find much in the house, but they did find in the lockup where we kept all our Santo Daime things, they found 85 liters of ayahuasca. Which is rather a lot of sacrament in one context, but we were hosting regular sessions with up to 100 people. And we were also at that time preparing for the European Encontro of Padre Alfredo and his comitiva from Sedumapia, when a lot of people would arrive from different European countries and around the world to do a big gathering of Santo Daime practitioners. So I was arrested, I was taken to the police station, I was put on bail. The bail conditions were very stringent. I was charged after a short time. The charges were very serious. I was charged not with possession of a banned substance or with distribution, but with conspiracy to contravene the prohibition on the importation of a banned substance. And as I had 85 liters of ayahuasca, which they equated with 85 kilos of a Class A drug, they considered that they had stumbled upon an extremely serious bunch of criminal drug dealers. So I was placed under a restraining order. I was under curfew in my own house. I had to wear an electronic bracelet on my ankle, and I had to report to the police station 7 days a week. My passport was taken away from me. My bank account was frozen. And I had to ask the court permission to do any work. As a professional musician, every gig that I did, I had to ask permission to do. And my wife, who's Japanese, they threatened to deport her from the country from violation of her visa. And so this went on for a while, and we, meanwhile, were not that rattled because we felt protected by the strength of the current of the work we were doing. And we knew there had been successful outcomes in other countries, in the USA, in Holland, and to a certain extent in France. And so we began to prepare our legal defense based on arguments of classification of ayahuasca and the religious use of ayahuasca under the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 9. We had a very good legal team. And we put together a dossier of information which we gave to the Director of Public Prosecutions. This was supported by letters of support from some padrinhos from Sedumapia in Brazil, some of the elders, Padrinho Alex Polari and Padre Alfredo, and we had some of the leading academic experts in the world had written testimonies for us, testifying to the safety of ayahuasca, and had also promised to come to the court and testify on our behalf. So we gave this dossier of information to the Director of Public Prosecutions, who at that time was a guy called Keir Starmer, who was known for his liberal views and his support of human rights. So we thought we had a chance. We asked him to consider our case as being a miscarriage of justice. So he carefully considered all this and agreed to do a full legal review of our case. But the outcome was not what we expected. The outcome was that they decided to take the case much more seriously. And they took the case away from the hands of the local police who were handling the investigation and put it in the hands of Scotland Yard, in the hands of the Serious Crimes and Anti-Terrorist Group. And we heard through our lawyers that they were asking for 12 to 20 years in prison for me, and they wanted my wife sent back to Japan, all our assets taken off us, and my children put into social care for being exposed to Class A drugs in the family home. Anyway, that was the situation we were facing, and to cut a long story short, after 2 years of facing this situation, just a few weeks before we were about to go to trial, without any warning, suddenly the prosecutors contacted our lawyers and said they decided to abandon the case, and they were not going to proceed with the trial. And they wrote a letter to our lawyers, and the key passage in the letter, which I'll read to you, says, evidence that it was believed would prove to be a key element of the offense, when carefully reviewed in the context of the whole case, is now believed to be insufficient for there to be a realistic prospect of conviction. This seems quite extraordinary when you think that I had made a written statement admitting to importing 85 liters of ayahuasca and distributing it. But what seems interesting here is that this phrase, within the context of the whole case, it seems that within the context of the whole case, they came to the conclusion that we were literally not guilty. They were looking for a criminal organization. But what they found was an organization that was organized, was transparent, responsible, and was attempting to operate according to ethical principles of conduct and duty of care, and had transparent accounting and transparent records of all the medicine we imported, which was always imported without disguising it as anything else or under anybody's false name or false address. And it seems that not only the judge, but also the prosecutors came to understand that we were not behaving as they initially reacted to believe we were, as criminals. And this process of understanding, you can see through our case, is reflected in other places around the world, in societies where slowly there seems to be coming a normalization of these practices, which have a legitimacy of their own as a way of life, because what was apparent through our experience is that we weren't seeking a quick thrill. We were developing a very grounded spiritual community of spiritual seekers who were receiving deep and lasting transformational benefit for themselves and for their communities. And so this dialogue, this process seems to be ongoing, and largely thanks to ICEAs and many other amazing individuals around the world, we are slowly moving towards a time when organizations such as ours will be able to self-regulate and will be able to openly engage in these healing practices. It may take a few years, but we have our sights set on the intention that these practices will become enshrined again in society, not only for indigenous communities, but all over the world, because these practices were once enshrined in all civilizations, and we lost them. And we need to have them back, especially now, in these times we're living in. There's a sense of urgency about this, not simply because we want to be seen as people who are not criminals, and we don't want to live in this grey, undefined zone where our activities are misunderstood, but because we actually know through our own experience the benefit these practices can bring. And this is a way of life that we're living. These are sacred practices. It's not something that can be reduced to discussions about chemical molecules and legal statutes and scientific analyses. The Santo Daime has been a blessing in my life and in all the people that I've encountered. I can say that I've taken part in over 2,000 ceremonies over the last 25 years, which means that over 10,000 liters of ayahuasca has been consumed in those ceremonies, and not one single person has come to any serious harm. There's never been any serious incidents or illnesses as a result of drinking this sacrament. Instead, people receive only health and happiness, well-being, genuine transformation, and understanding and insights into the concepts of universal enlightenment, peace, harmony, and love. So this is my journey, and what I've learned from it is, firstly, it's important to be grounded, to be organized, to be responsible, to conduct affairs according to the highest possible standards of being honest and ethical and accountable and transparent. And the more we follow these principles, the more easy it will be for those in authority that don't yet understand our practices to come to a genuine understanding of who we are and what we're doing. The second thing I learned is that there is a potential for things to go seriously wrong. And when that happens, we mustn't panic, because it's very much like inside a ritual or a ceremony when we're faced with some challenging moments or pair, some shadowy energies come to us. We need to develop firmeza and confidence and faith in our practice, and enter into these processes with the confidence that all these shadow energies can be transformed and uplifted into the light, and we can emerge stronger as a result. And this is not something we would wish for, but at the same time, when it does come, we need to affirm these transformative principles and not buckle under the weight of the presence of police and prosecutors and courts and threats of different kinds. And that brings me to the third point, which is what is perhaps most important of all, is community. To be connected, to develop links, to share information, and to break down barriers of misunderstanding, and to build this network of connections, not only in the mind, but in the heart, and to be open to other forms of practice, and to stand united. And hopefully in this conference, we are here with the theme of building unity in diversity. Thank you.